Why did President Ibrahim Traoré release 150,000 dairy cows across the savannas of Burkina Faso? At first, it seemed like madness, a shocking gamble that critics said would bankrupt the nation. But to Traoré, it wasn't madness. It was survival. For decades, Burkina Faso had been trapped in a cycle of dependency. Imported food drained the economy. Droughts pushed families into hunger. Foreign aid dictated the pace of life. Traoré knew the nation could not move forward by relying on handouts. He needed something bold. Something powerful. Something that would change the DNA of the economy. And so, the cows were released. But this was not just about livestock. Each cow represented milk for children, meat for families, hides for industry, and fertilizer for crops. Each herd was a living factory feeding people, boosting farming, and sparking new village economies. For the poorest communities, the cows were more than food. They were wealth. A family with cows suddenly had assets, opportunities, and dignity. Women became leaders in trade. Villages once known for scarcity now became hubs of milk, butter, and leather. Of course, the world doubted him. Economists warned of chaos. International voices called it reckless. Even some within his own government questioned the logistics. But Traoré stood firm. Let them call it madness, he said. If milk flows in every village, if beef is within reach of every family, then they will see. This is not madness. This is liberation. And soon, the results began to show. Milk markets opened. Leather workshops revived. Farmers used dung to boost harvests. Jobs appeared where none had existed. More than food security, the cows brought unity. By spreading herds across provinces, Traoré was redistributing wealth and giving every region a stake in the future. Globally, the message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for charity, it was creating its own solutions. What began as a risky experiment became a symbol of sovereignty and resilience. At dawn, when the herd spread across the red earth and endless grass, the image was unforgettable. Villagers saw not just animals, but hope. The first drops of milk in their buckets were more than nutrition. They were the taste of a new era. Traoré's gamble proved that bold vision, grounded in faith in the people, could reshape the destiny of a nation. For decades, Burkina Faso was trapped in a cycle of dependency. Foreign aid controlled development, imported food drained precious currency, and every drought left millions facing hunger. President Traoré knew this pattern had to be broken, and small reforms would never be enough. He needed a symbol, a system, and a shock. The cows became all three. But this wasn't only about livestock. Each cow was a walking factory, producing milk, protein, and fertilizer. Each herd could boost farming, spark village trade, and become a lifeline against famine. Beyond the economics, the move was deeply symbolic. A nation starved of hope could now look across once barren lands and see thousands of cows grazing, a powerful image of abundance where there had only been scarcity. Critics, of course, attacked the plan. International observers called it reckless. Economists warned of impossible costs and logistical chaos. Even some of Traoré's own ministers doubted the government could manage so many animals, with distribution, veterinary care, and regulation all on the line. But Traoré stood firm. Let them call it madness, he reportedly said. What they do not see is the hunger in the eyes of our children. If milk flows in every village, if beef is within reach of every family, then they will understand. This is not madness. This is liberation. His vision reached far beyond food. Dairy cows would transform trade in rural Burkina Faso. Villages once surviving only on subsistence farming would now have surplus milk to sell, barter, or turn into cheese and butter. Meat would nourish families in feed markets. Hides would revive the leather industry. Fertilizer from dung would enrich sorghum and millet fields, raising crop yields. This wasn't just about giving cows, it was about seeding an entire agro-industrial ecosystem. There was also a sharp political calculation. By dispersing herds across the country, Traoré was literally redistributing wealth. Suddenly, the poorest villages held assets worth thousands of dollars. Communities long left behind now had food, income, and power. Instead of division, there was unity, and every region became a stakeholder in the new economy. On the global stage, the message was clear: Burkina Faso refused to be defined by famine and weakness. The release of 150,000 cows was a declaration of sovereignty, an audacious step toward food independence. For a continent too often portrayed as dependent on charity, it was both inspiring and defiant. Still, the gamble was immense. Feeding, vaccinating, and managing such a vast herd required coordination on a scale the nation had never attempted. Critics warned of disease outbreaks, black market smuggling, and market disruptions. But Traoré turned even these risks into opportunities. He launched a national herd guard teams of veterinary workers, herders, and community leaders trained to protect, manage, and grow this living wealth. The program created jobs, built skills, and gave people a sense of ownership over their future. When news first broke that President Ibrahim Traoré had released 150,000 dairy cows onto the savannas of Burkina Faso, the world reacted with disbelief. In Paris, London, and Washington, analysts scoffed. How could one of Africa's poorest nations, where GDP per person ranks among the lowest in the world, spend millions on cows instead of traditional aid programs or roads and bridges? To outsiders, it looked like reckless populism. To Traoré, it was something far greater, a carefully engineered gamble with both economic and political dimensions. He had studied history well. Traoré knew that famine does more than starve people, it breaks nations. Hunger fuels conflict, erodes sovereignty, and leaves governments vulnerable to foreign manipulation. For decades, recurring droughts had trapped Burkina Faso in this very cycle. Imported wheat and powdered milk became lifelines, but they also deepened dependency. Every shipment of grain tied the nation tighter to foreign debt. Traoré's answer was radical: flip the script. Instead of begging for food aid, Burkina Faso would flood its own markets with milk and meat. Not a trickle. Not a token. An abundance. This was the heart of the gamble. Food aid provides short-term relief, but cows are a long-term investment and an uncertain one. Each animal required vaccines, veterinary care, and feed during the dry months. Disease outbreaks loomed as constant threats. And then there was the staggering upfront cost. Critics calculated that the government had poured nearly half its annual development budget into this single initiative. One European diplomat sneered, "It's like putting all your chips on one roll of the dice." But Traoré wasn't gambling on cows alone, he was gambling on psychology. He understood something his critics didn't: hunger was the greatest weapon against any African government. If families could eat beef regularly, if children could drink milk every day, faith in the state would rise. Hope would return. By feeding his people, Traoré was disarming the most dangerous force of all: desperation. The brilliance of the plan didn't stop with people. Traoré also had his eyes on the environment. Desertification had been swallowing Burkina Faso's farmland year after year. Wild animals, antelopes, elephants, even lions, were being pushed into villages, raiding crops, and sparking deadly conflicts with farmers. By releasing cows into controlled grazing zones, Traoré created something entirely new: a dual buffer system. Milk and meat flowed to people, while grasslands and water points were managed for both domestic cattle and wildlife. The cows became not only engines of the economy but also a bridge between humans and nature. For the first time, feeding people meant feeding ecosystems too. Still, the genius of the plan lay in how Traoré framed it to his people. He didn't talk about livestock assets or economic multipliers. He spoke about dignity. Standing before villages, he declared, "No child in Burkina Faso should ever go to bed hungry when God has given us land and grass. Milk is strength. Meat is pride. We will stand tall because our stomachs are full." This message was everything. While foreign newspapers mocked it as a cow stunt, inside Burkina Faso it became a rallying cry for sovereignty. The cows weren't just animals, they were symbols of freedom, living proof that the nation could rise on its own terms. Of course, the logistics were daunting. To make the program work, thousands of veterinary students were recruited and trained in record time. A nationwide cattle corridor system was created, allowing herds to migrate seasonally without destroying farmland. A national herd guard, a force of veterinarians, herders, and community leaders, was deployed to protect the investment, prevent disease outbreaks, and stop smuggling across borders. Each step of the plan created jobs, skills, and a sense of shared responsibility. Families didn't just receive cows, they became caretakers of a new future. The gamble was costly. It was risky. But as the first streams of milk filled village buckets and the first herds grazed peacefully under the setting sun, it became clear that this was more than an agricultural project. It was a bold reimagining of what a nation could do when it chose courage over dependency. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for handouts. It was feeding its own people, and in doing so, reclaiming its sovereignty. The shocking gamble of 150,000 cows was not just about ending hunger. It was about proving that even the poorest nations can rise with bold vision, courage, and the will to rewrite their destiny. New milk collection centers began to rise across villages, many powered by solar energy, where farmers could bring their surplus and sell it. In the cities of Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, old milk plants roared back to life, processing butter, cheese, and powdered milk that could be stored for months. The project didn't just create food, it created work. Thousands of new jobs appeared. Herders, drivers, traders, factory workers, entire industries awakened. But not everyone was celebrating. European dairy exporters, who had long dumped cheap powdered milk into West African markets, suddenly felt threatened. Meat importers saw their business shrinking. For decades, Africa had been the customer, now Burkina Faso was becoming the competitor. Traoré saw this backlash coming. He moved quickly, forging regional alliances with Mali, Niger, and Ghana. He made sure that any surplus milk and beef could flow across borders, transforming Burkina Faso from a dependent buyer into a regional hub of dairy and meat trade. This gamble was never just national, it was continental. And yet, the genius of Traoré's move wasn't only economic. It was symbolic. Across the savannah, rivers of cattle were filmed from helicopters, herds stretching as far as the eye could see. Villages danced as milk poured into buckets. Children tasted cheese for the very first time. These images swept across Africa, igniting debates from Dar es Salaam to Addis Ababa.